Hey y'all, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am coming to you with a series review of the Last Kingdom series, or the Saxon Stories series by Bernard Cornwell. I have been sitting around ruminating on this for a few months, ever since I read the last book, which came out towards the end of last year, and I decided that since this is my favorite historical fiction series, certainly, and potentially just my favorite book series of all time, I thought it deserved a dedicated review. I'm going to go on and prepare you now and say that this will likely be a pretty rambly review because this is a 13-book historical fiction series, and so there's a lot of ground to cover. There are a lot of ways in which this review could go, and in some ways I wish I'd been reviewing each individual book as I was reading them. So the Saxon Stories series by Bernard Cornwell is a 13-book historical fiction series set during the Viking Age in Britain, and it was written across many years, but I think I can sum up the main storyline of this series, and certainly the main storyline of this first book, pretty easily. Our main character, Uhtred, is a Saxon who is living in 9th century Britain. And he is essentially abducted after a raid by the Vikings. And so he is actually taken in by them, and he is essentially raised as a Dane. And then later on in his life, he does come back to kind of the Anglo-Saxon side of things. And so Uhtred plays a really interesting role by kind of going between the Viking side and the Anglo-Saxon side and not really fitting in with either one of them, which makes him a really interesting figure and really makes him a character that both sides vie for, that both sides really want to have on their side. Now, Uhtred is a completely fictional character, and the vast majority of characters that you meet in this series are also fictional, but there are quite a few that are actual historical figures. My goal with things was to keep this pretty spoiler-free regarding the fictional characters. But regarding the major historical characters, I don't know that I can really steer clear of spoilers, because more broadly than just Uhtred finding his place among the Saxons or among the Danes as kind of a figure between these two very different worlds, but also very similar worlds, there is the larger storyline that is essentially the main plot line and the main point of the series, which is the creation of England as a country. So the historical background for the Last Kingdom, the first book in the series, is around the years when Alfred the Great is about to become king. So this series spans a really long period of time from around the time that Alfred the Great becomes king to the Battle of Brunanburh, which is when King Athelstan essentially submits the formation of England. And King Athelstan is Alfred's grandson. And prior to King Alfred, the area that we now call England was actually a series of disparate kingdoms. And so the Last Kingdom, the title of the first book, actually refers to Wessex, which was the last kingdom in the area that we now know as England, to hold out against the Viking raiders. This first book kind of chronicles how some of these other kingdoms fall to the Viking invaders and eventually are kind of ruled by petty kings or puppet kings that the Vikings put in place, or are just ultimately settled by the Vikings, such as in the case of Northumbria, which is where Uhtred is from. Wessex is the last kingdom. It's the last kingdom to hold out against this kind of Norse invasion. And this is paralleled in the final book by Northumbria being the final kingdom, holding out against kind of Saxon hegemony, holding out against becoming part of England. And so it's a really interesting poetic parallel that Bernard Cornwell does not come up with. The large majority of these books is based in real historical fact. Though we are dealing with Uhtred, who is a fictional character, and the majority of the characters who surround him are fictional, he is very much involved in actual historical events of the day. And they are done so beautifully. If Bernard Cornwell changes anything, he is pretty straight up about why he did it. So there's always an author's note at the end of each book that kind of describes the actual historical event that took place in that book and whether or not he changed anything, because in some cases he definitely has to give Uhtred a really interesting plot or kind of a favorable position in the narrative. This series is frequently sold as a Viking series, and that's largely my own personal background with it. That's why I picked it up, because I really wanted to read more historical fiction about the Vikings. But I would say this series is actually more of an Anglo-Saxon series. The Vikings are definitely present, and Uhtred sides with them on some things. And I think the books have a very bingeable quality because they're actually really rather short, and typically I used to read them in one sitting, and so I do think you will still really love it now that you can binge it. But I know a lot of people are scared off by the fact that there are 13 books in it, but trust me, they don't ever feel that long. And I think if you connect to Uhtred as a character, you will want more than 13 books. But that's something that I will also say. I think when people don't like this series, when they don't take to this series, it's not necessarily that they don't take to the time period, though I have seen that complaint. This can be a relatively dense time period to get into. To me, that's understandable too, but I think the large majority of people who don't get on with this straight up don't like Uhtred as a character. And so I do think your enjoyment of the series is tied to how much you like Uhtred. And I just absolutely love Uhtred. The funny thing about it is that he likely kind of falls into the category of a bit of a Mary Sue. He's good at everything. Everyone likes him, and if they don't like him, they at least respect him. And yet, that never bothers me. I think Uhtred earns it, and I think the fun thing is, and maybe it's not fun so much as really harrowing and really realistic, is that you see Uhtred start at the top of his game. Really, when he reaches adulthood in the Last Kingdom, he's 20 years old. He's a great warrior. He's making his name. And in the last book, he's hurting. He really can't fight anymore. And he knows the younger men on the field want to go up against him, want to defeat and kill him to make their name in a similar way to the way that he used to be when he was young. And it's such a natural and understandable progression for his character to go from kind of cocky and arrogant and knowing I'm the best at everything to understanding that my way of life is over. You know, I am making way for a new generation, and everything I knew, particularly with the kind of foundation of England as a country, everything I knew, the languages I used to speak, the religion I follow, all of that is going away. And so there's a lot of really deep stuff to this series that I really enjoy, and is largely why I enjoy it. A lot of other people enjoy it because it has some really great battle scenes. But to kind of get into some of those deeper issues that I think Bernard Cornwell absolutely nails. The first one that I want to talk about is kind of the interaction between Saxon and Danish culture, because the Saxons actually hail from a similar area to the Danes. They hail from an area in Germany, actually. And so they actually have a lot of parallels in their culture. When the Saxons came over and they entered the area that we now call England, they were very similar to the Norse and to the Danes. They actually worshipped very similar gods. And when Christianity came in and superseded that, the Saxons did convert to Christianity. But many of them, when the Danes and the Norse start coming over, do feel the call to go back to the older gods. And the interesting thing too is that there are many Danes that understand the power of the Christian God. And so they want to pull the Christian God into their own pantheon and continue worshiping the old gods like Thor, but also worship the Christian God, because they recognize the power that all of these gods have on the battlefield. There can be a lot of superstition in Old Norse Danish culture. There's a lot of kind of conversation around curses in this series, and that the Danes definitely believe in curses, in omens. They won't fight on certain days unless they know that the weather is favorable, unless they've seen a certain bird fly in the sky. And it's just really interesting, because then the parallel is shown in Saxon culture, kind of through monks and through Christianity, that there's also a level of superstition. They won't fight unless they feel like they see a sign from God. They won't fight unless they know it's favorable. And so there's a lot of interaction between Danish and Saxon culture that is really fascinating, especially towards the end of this series, when the Danes have been in the area for a very long time. During Alfred the Great's reign, the Dane Law was created. So this was an area in kind of the Midlands and to the north of England where the Danish settlers really were allowed to do whatever they wanted. They settled this area. And so by the time of the last book, there have been generations of Danish settlers in this area, and so many of them have kind of given up the old ways, and so many of the Saxons in the area have kind of gone back to the old ways. And for me, this is my bread and butter in terms of the Viking Age. This is what I think is fascinating. I think the kind of overlap of cultures, the overlap of religion in particular, is really, really fascinating. And so I'll move into religion now, which I think is another thing that Bernard Cornwell gets right, and that I think is just genuinely fascinating in this period. I think there is so much to dig into from a religious perspective. So Uhtred, because he has been raised as a Dane, is actually a pagan. And he worships the Old Norse religion, though he's been baptized multiple times. And when he kind of comes back into the Saxon realm, they assume he's going to become a Christian again, but he's absolutely not interested in that. That's a source of a lot of confusion and mistrust from the Saxons towards him. But in that, it's not so much that Uhtred doesn't believe in the Christian God or in Jesus, it's that he recognizes they have power, but he doesn't really want to have anything to do with the Christian afterlife, with the Christian way of living. He recognizes the Christian God's power, but the Norse way of life is for him. And this is paralleled by a lot of Danes and Norsemen converting to Christianity. Some of these conversions are definitely for political reasons, and you know that. You know they're going to automatically renege on it. Some of them are really genuine conversions, and yet these people don't want to totally leave their old way of life behind. You will see men die who have converted to Christianity, and they still reach for a weapon. They still want a weapon in hand when they die in case they get to go to Valhalla. And so I just really love the interaction of religion in this period. I think Bernard Cornwell has done it really well. There are a lot of people in this series who kind of toe the line between both religions. I think people often think the Vikings wanted to eradicate Christianity or wanted to eradicate the Christian gods. And that's not true. For a lot of them, they wanted to kind of bring him into the Old Norse pantheon, or they believed both in the Christian God and in Thor. Because you'll often see in a lot of burials at this time period that some men will be buried both with a cross, have a Christian burial even, be facing the east, but they will also be wearing their hammer of Mjolnir, Thor's hammer. Religion was a very complex issue at this time, and I like that Bernard Cornwell never strayed away from it. The last thing on my list of kind of deeper things that were going on is I really just love the poetic nature that parallels kind of this first book and the last book in terms of the Last Kingdom. The Last Kingdom at the beginning of the series is Wessex holding out against the Vikings. The Last Kingdom at the end of the series is Northumbria holding out against kind of becoming England. So there's a lot of poetic nature in the series that also comes from, the historical perspective. At its heart, this is a really fun series. It's a really refreshing series. It's a series that kind of gives your brain a break, but I think there's a lot of deep stuff going on. I think there are a lot of important conversations being held about this time period within this series. And so I didn't want to leave that by the wayside and just gush about how much I love Uhtred and all of the characters. But I think we can move into characters now. I think the characters are the strongest part of this series. Like I said, if you don't like Uhtred, I really don't think you're going to like the series as a whole because you were in his head the entire time. But I really think where Bernard Cornwell shines is in discussing the historical figures, in discussing the historical characters, such as Alfred the Great. This series' portrayal of Alfred the Great is absolutely incredible. I have never seen anything like it before, and I doubt I will ever see anything like it again. It is just so wonderful. It's such a dynamic and layered portrayal of Alfred the Great. And I say that like there are so many books to choose from with Alfred the Great representation in them, and there's really not. Alfred is unfortunately a historical character that has kind of fallen by the wayside. I think that is really, really unfortunate because he is such an interesting man. I think when people hear about Alfred the Great, he seems mythic and he seems larger than life, and he definitely does in this series, but from Uhtred that he was also just a man. He was a man with problems. He was a man who struggled with his own demons, and you see that through Uhtred's eyes, and it actually makes you admire Alfred more than if he were just this kind of legendary king whose dream of England eventually came true one day. It makes Alfred not only a character that you enjoy reading about, that you enjoy spending time with, but it makes him into a figure that you also really respect. When it comes to historical figures that you would like to meet, Alfred the Great rates pretty highly for me, and it's largely because of this series. I think with many historical figures, we think we would want to meet them, but we would be inevitably disappointed by their shortcomings because they never addressed them. But I think you get the sense that Alfred the Great is a man who would acknowledge his shortcomings and be incredibly proud of his accomplishments. I genuinely love Alfred the Great, and I not only love him, but I respect him as a person. I respect him as a figure, and I think that largely comes from this series. I think the other historical figures get a similar treatment. I think Athelstan gets a similar treatment, though not to the degree of Alfred. In fact, I was a little bit disappointed in the portrayal of Athelstan because I thought he was going to get more, but I do think the portrayal of Alfred's daughter, Ethelfled, who is a really important figure towards the middle half of this series. She is so wonderful. She is so strong. She might be my favorite female character from this series. She's so strong. Her relationship with Uhtred is really interesting. And you also have a lot of respect for her as a woman trying to make her way in a man's world. But on the fictional side, you not only have Uhtred, you have really wonderful characters who were kind of in his band of friends. His friend Finan, who is an Irishman, is probably my favorite side character in the series. He also has a friend who is a monk, whose name is Father Beaka, who is a really wonderful character. There are so many really great characters and really great antagonists. Each book typically has one antagonist and kind of one battle. And some of these antagonists are real historical figures. Some of them are fictional characters. My favorite antagonists are from books 3 and 4, which are Lords of the North and Sword Song. So those are my favorite antagonists, though I love the antagonist in The Last Kingdom as well. Now, in a series that is 13 books, there are definitely highs and lows in that series, and so I thought I would tell you some of my favorite books and my least favorite book in the series. Lords of the North, which is the third book, is potentially my favorite in the series, and I actually think that's when the series hits its stride, is around book 3. I think that's when it knows what it wants to do, and it knows what it wants to do specifically with Uhtred as a character. But I also think The Last Kingdom, the first book in the series, is a really strong entry, and it's a really great beginner's book. I think it's a really strong series starter. But I also have a soft spot for book 2, which is The Pale Horseman, because I think actually my favorite female character is in book 2. I really love the female character in this second book, and that is something I will say that I think the series could be better on. There are very few women in this series who were in more than one book. Ethelfled is maybe the only one, and so I think that could definitely be improved upon, but it's not actually something that really bothers me, again, because I really loved Uhtred as a character. But this is a very kind of typical historical fantasy series in that way, in that essentially there is a woman in every book for Uhtred to get with. But I think my favorite female character is from The Pale Horseman, which is book 2. My favorite fictional female character anyway, because I do really think his portrayal of Ethelfled is really strong. I also really loved book 13, Warlord, because I really did shed a tear at it. I thought that I would. I was really dreading finishing the series out for a wide variety of reasons, because it's been my favorite, and because often when I finish the series, when I read the last book in a series, I have the sense that I probably won't return to it again, because often when I finish a series, that kind of closes the door for it for me. And this goes with any series, with television series, with movie series. If I have seen the last one, I very rarely have a desire to go back to anything prior, to restart it, to reread it, because sometimes for me there's just a real sense of finality with the series. And I often am also very disappointed in the ending to series. And this was just a really spectacular case where I had no need to have any of those fears. I really thought I would shut the door on Warlord and I probably wouldn't want to return to Uhtred again. But the interesting thing is that when I finished Warlord, I automatically wanted to pick up the first book again because it was such a great ride, because he had nailed the ending so well. I just felt like not only did I love the journey the first time through, but I feel like tomorrow I could pick up any book in the series and I would love it. I would love it just as much as the first time. And I think the reason that I feel that way is because the ending was so strong. This book made me so emotional. There were so many flashbacks to kind of older characters who hadn't been in it in a really long time. And it was just kind of emotional that we got to see Uhtred witness the culmination of things that he has been working for during this entire 13-book series. Uhtred is an old man in this last book, and he has the sense he's not long for this world. And it's just a really, really wonderful send-off for his character, the things that he gets to see and the places that he gets to be in this last book, the characters that he gets to see again, and the memories that he ruminates on. It's just really, really wonderful. And it's really rewarding if you have been a fan of this series for a long time, if you've been a fan of it for years, like me. I think the ending is so incredibly strong. There is no need to be worried about it. Everything in this final book feels earned. I think often in the final book in a series, there's kind of a rush to do something big, to kind of end the series with a bang, and you often feel like characters end up in a place that really doesn't fit with them, that things happen in the end that don't feel earned. Everything that happened in this book felt like it was set up in previous books. And to a certain extent, that's largely because he has stuck pretty closely to the historical timeline here. And so he's kind of dictated by what history did. But on a character level, all of that was set up by Bernard Cornwell in earlier books. In terms of weaker books in the series, I think the second to last book, Sword of Kings, which was book 12, was actually rather weak compared to the rest of the series, in that it felt like it really should have been leading towards the end. It really should have been building toward a pretty fantastic ending, and it felt like any other book in the series to me. It didn't feel like it was building to anything particularly grand, which I do think is kind of a weakness for it. I think towards the end of the series, we should have been feeling a little bit of dread, maybe, or a little bit of emotion anyway, that we knew we were teetering towards the end, and I don't think this book particularly set that up very well. The one, though, that I struggled with the most and that I think is the weakest for me on a personal level is The Pagan Lord, which is book 7 in the series. And the reason that this book is the weakest is because it follows book 6. The 6th book is called The Death of Kings, so you might can imagine what happens in this one. And it's a really, really spectacular book. It's one of the most interesting in the series, and it's also one of the most emotional. I think it's a book in the series that has quite a bit of heart. Now, I will tell you which king dies, because again, I am going to be straight up about the history. This is the book when Alfred dies. And so Alfred's been sick for a little while, and this is the book that he dies. So book 7, The Pagan Lord, picks up automatically where that one left off, with Alfred's son essentially inheriting the throne. And Alfred's son, Edward, is not half the man that Alfred is. In some ways, he's not even a quarter of the man that Alfred is. He's not bad, but he's not interesting. Alfred was really, really interesting, and his loss is one that I think it takes the series a long time to recover from. A lot of that is not due to Bernard Cornwell's skill at all. It's that a lot of the people in the next generation are kind of between figures. So the generation between Alfred the Great and Athelstan is really a generation that is often forgotten by history because it is sandwiched between two greats of the period. Athelstan is remembered very, very fondly as the first king of a united England. Alfred the Great is the one who kind of set that dream in motion. And so his children often really vie for space on the page of historical documents, in my opinion. They are often really ignored. And it's not just them, it's everyone around them. Where earlier in the series, all of the Vikings feel very interesting, they are also typically legendary or historical figures that you're really excited excited to see. They are really famous Vikings in the early series and also in the later books in the series. But in this middle portion and in this book in particular, they also fall short. But the thing that really makes me irritated about this book, the thing that makes book 7 the weakest in the series in my opinion, not only did Alfred die, but several other fictional characters that you have come to know and love, that you were really, really attached to, that Uhtred was really attached to, die off page. You end book 6 with a real sense of grief for Alfred, but you think to yourself, well, at least we still have these people. And then you open up book 7, and in the first chapter, they tell you that characters that you really, really had come to know and love, and that Uhtred was also really attached to, died off page, which seems really careless. I would say that's probably the biggest mistake Bernard Cornwell made in this series, and it is one that they changed for the television show. In fact, when I finished book 7, The Pagan Lord, I actually put the series down, and I didn't really intend to come back to it. I actually was going to DNF the series because that book left me so bitter, but eventually I came back to it because my love for Uhtred was just so great. So again, I think if you love Uhtred, if you were really attached to Uhtred, you will really want to see this series through to the end, and you will also feel like you could have read more books, which is a really wild thing to say about a series with 13 books. This series is a really strong recommend from me if you are looking for kind of a Viking-oriented series. Though it is mostly Anglo-Saxon, it does actually focus on the Vikings quite a bit. If you were looking for kind of a Viking-oriented series, or just a historical fiction series in general, or just a series where you really like the characters, I really, really highly recommend this one. I don't think it will work for everybody. I think you have to be somebody who is kind of into action scenes to really enjoy it, and also into the politics of the age, which I really am. This series is my bread and butter. Everything about it works for me. Everything about it really hits a personal mark with me. So I just really, really love it. And if you have picked it up and loved it too, I would love to know that down below. And if you intend to pick up this series, also let me know that down below. But that's going to be all for me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Goodbye.